Today I talked with Stuart Verity. We talked about Theosophy, Vipassana meditation retreats in the Goenka style, his 3 visits to the Kumbh Mela in India, one of the largest religious festivals in the world. We talked about psilocybin mushrooms and the spiritual experiences that they can induce, and also ayahuasca, drinking ayahuasca with the Santo Daime Church, the Brazilian group. Also, Stuart has been doing Tai Chi and Qigong for 20 years and is a teacher of that now. He did a postgraduate certificate in integral theory with the JFK University in San Francisco, and for the last 10 years has been studying Dzogchen, the Tibetan tradition, with Daniel P. Brown, who in my opinion is one of the greatest teachers of that, Western teachers of that in the world alive at the moment. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you. Okay, Stuart Verity, welcome and thanks very much for joining me.
Hi, Ralph. Good to be here.
So this is our first face-to-face meeting, so to speak, screen to screen. Mm-hmm. We never met in person, but as so often is the case with when people have a shared interest, you just sort of connect online, and we had a long phone conversation a while ago, probably about 2 hours. First time we'd ever talked, and we talked for 2 hours. So it was really good. And we have a lot of shared interests, and so I'm doing this series of talks to people about their personal journey with an integrated practice of across the broad domains of body, heart, mind, and spirit. And most of the people I've interviewed we've connected around integral theory to begin with, which is how you and I met each other. And I think you actually might be the the most qualified person I've talked to so far about the integral theory stuff, because you've done a postgraduate degree.
Yes, that's it. It was a postgraduate diploma, I think. I wanted to do the MA, but that was 3 years, and a year and a half was as much as I managed to keep up with. So I ended up with integral theory certificate from the JFK University. Yeah.
Cool. So I'd love to know what that. We could talk about that a bit later, about what that was like doing it. I presume you did it online, because
we did it online. Yeah, we had a couple of times. I went to the States for a week to meet face to face the other people that were participating, and then it was done online. It was like a 24-hour a week study time, and then meeting online to discuss at various points. So it was quite intense, but it was good to read the Wilbur stuff and then double check that I'd got the right take on it. So it was a useful year and a half. Yeah.
Cool. So we're just going to kind of run through your story with these transformational practices in kind of roughly chronological order. So where do you want to start?
Well, I suppose we'll start back, I guess, when I first started to find spiritual practices or organizations that were teaching meditation and things, and I guess the start of my spiritual journey. And I grew up in the north of England in Darlington, and left school at 16 and went and did an apprenticeship, and then in my early 20s decided I'd like to go back to school or to university, and I ended up doing an art foundation course, and ended up going eventually to Liverpool to do a fine art sculpture BA. And it was during that time, leaving home and being in a fresh city. The first city I was in doing my art foundation course was Leeds. And I remember looking around to see what was happening in the meditation world or spiritual practice world, and coming across the Theosophical Society. And they had a house not far from where I lived, with a beautiful stained glass window of a lotus. So it was a stained glass window with an Oriental theme. And I started going along there for meditation classes and things. And I think my first sort of intense experience was I was given a tape recording of a sort of a middle pillar type meditation with the 5 sort of elements, and it was probably of a Kabbalistic or possibly Vedanta orientation. And I did this for weeks, used it as a training wheel, and got very, very used to that sort of middle pillar meditation. And then I had a strange experience. A friend had collected some magic mushrooms from up on the hills above Leeds, and made some tea. And we had an interesting evening, and at some point we put this meditation tape on, and did the hour's worth of middle pillar meditation with the assistance of the mushrooms, which really enhanced our concentration abilities and visualization abilities. And this was a real sort of awakening, and nothing had really happened like this before. So I experienced a very luminous version of the middle pillar meditation exercise, and it had quite a profound effect on me.
What kind of age were you at that time?
I was 23.
Right.
So I was a young, mature student. I was 23, so I qualified to be a mature student, but I was a young, mature student, I guess.
A couple of things that I've been thinking of just listening to what you said is when I was at school, I did art at school, and we did Mondrian at some point, and he was quite into Theosophy.
Yes.
Informed a lot of his art, but it didn't make any sense to me at the time. I mean, in my teenage years, and I think Theosophy, something I don't know a great deal about myself, other than, I mean, I was very into Krishnamurti.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I still am. I think Krishnamurti is one of those spiritual giants, and he's got that interesting story of being seen on the beach as a 14-year-old boy by one of the guys in the Theosophical Society, and talked into coming back to England and being groomed as this world teacher. And I'm sure a lot of people know the story, but it's
yes, they have a colourful history and colourful stories all the way from the start right the way through. But the Krishnamurti is it's an interesting one. And
also when I had my first ever psychedelic experience was LSD as a teenager, and I was at school going to church a lot, and they talk about these experiences that prophets were having, in the Old Testament and stuff, and it never really made any sense, and none of them were talking about actually having these experiences ourselves. And then the first time I took LSD, I was like, wow, I was actually having my own first ever experience of what was being talked about.
Yes.
And it's that's quite a rite of passage, I think, for anybody to have that first ever first person mystical experience, and is often precipitated by some kind of psychedelic like mushrooms and LSD for young people.
Yes.
And it's kind of in the culture.
it's in the culture, it's even in the culture with our meditation teachers that we end up often have their own story about their late 60s, psychedelic festival experience. It's something that opens you up to realize that there is something there, very tangible, first person phenomenological experience. It's sort of a blessing and a curse in a way, because it's difficult to talk about it because of the prohibition of drugs or intoxicants in many spiritual traditions. So it's off the cards of being talked about. So it's sort of a blessing and a curse, but you end up with this almost this secret experience that you can't quite explain, and there's not many people in your society until you find meditation teachers that have had the same experience that can contextualize it for you.
Yeah, I think that for me, it had been quite a few years of psychedelics experiences before I encountered Tibetan Buddhism, which is another thing you and I share an interest in that. And for the first time, I heard people talking about actually people having these experiences through doing certain types of practice, and it was that had never happened. You and I living in England with the kind of upbringings we've had, the encounters with religion, it's very exoteric, quite dogmatic. It's not so much about inner transformation is kind of alluded to, but Jesus and the prophets had these experiences, and probably nobody else will, because nobody's as perfect as them. That's kind of the message I was given.
Yes, as if it was a historic event and they had it, and now we sort of feed off the breadcrumbs of that table or whatever. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's even part of the one of the texts in Anglican Christianity is we're not worthy to feed on the crumbs from underneath your table. I remember reciting that as a child, thinking, crikey, that's really severe. Yeah.
And after I was in finished art foundation in Leeds, I got onto the BA Fine Art course in Liverpool, John Moores University, and through the yoga society of the Students' Union, I sort of reconnected with the Theosophists, but this time in Liverpool. And just because my yoga teacher through the Yoga Society of the Students' Union was a member, and I went along, and I was very conscious that I was the youngest person there, and a lot of the Theosophists were much older and from a different generation, basically. And I really, it's got a fantastic history, the Theosophical Society, almost going back to the sort of 1880s. You could say the New Age movement maybe started back in the 1880s with this huge interest in the esoteric aspects of any tradition rather than the exoteric. So people were hungry for the meditation immersive experiences and the esoteric rather than the exoteric. And I guess they were the early sort of New Age bridge builders, and people like Madame Blavatsky went off on their own spiritual searches around India and had intense experiences with different teachers, and they eventually ended up moving their headquarters to India. But they weren't the sort of people I could have spoken to about my sort of first-person mystical experience. So again, there's this sort of sobriety, spirituality, and then a little bit more adventurous shamanic type spirituality. And I was lucky in Liverpool that I just spotted a book, or I think my housemate bought a book home. It was Robert Anton Wilson, Cosmic Trigger. This is a book that he bought back from the library. And I opened it up, and it was Robert Anton Wilson. I guess he's part of the Beat movement and also part of the sort of hippie protest movement. And he continued to write sort of manuals and instructions to help people out that had had both the meditation experience, spiritual experience, blended with the psychedelic experience. So Cosmic Trigger was his autobiography of him having the similar experience, and how him and his peer group coped with it. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, the protest movement blended with the LSD movement, and created a lot of motivation for people to come out en masse, become sensitive to certain issues, equality issues. And we sort of know the history of that. It was a little bit too motivational, and as a consequence that the authorities clamped down on it and declared LSD illegal. And but it was all the same. It was very interesting, at least being able to tap in to somebody from a previous generation that had the same spiritual psychedelic experience. And then the main polemic of Robert Anton Wilson's work was to put conspiracy theories aside, try and get real. And if you've had a spiritual opening, it's good to have a non-psychedelic practice that you're doing on a daily basis that can add stability to your awakening. So I really took that to heart, and thought perhaps the hippie movement was short-lived because they hadn't done enough of balancing it with non-psychedelic practices. So it was a thing I took on board to sort of follow at a very early age, this advice to support it via, for me back then, my choices were Hatha Yoga and continuing doing a sort of Raja Yoga meditation. So I dropped away from the Theosophical Society because they weren't really offering this, and I ended up having a meditation mentor that had been a correspondent friends with Robert Anton Wilson. And he was a musician called Mike Keane, who had a band at that time called Royal Family and the Poor. And they were out on Factory Records. So this was a young guy with a great interest in everything Hinduism, and had gone into a lot of meditation. And for a while he'd been a Hare Krishna, so he got into the Bhakti thing, and he'd had some Bhakti openings whilst also on psychedelics, which had really motivated him to also travel this path of the non-psychedelic practices to support and stabilize a sort of opening. So I sort of went along with that support.
Yeah, we can explore this later when we get into some of the other topics. But I was writing today a little bit about psychedelics and how they interact with meditation, and the biggest shift, the actual complete shift in my identity that I've experienced over the last 20 years or whatever, has been precipitated by meditation practice, an actual fundamental shift in who I take myself to be.
Yes, who you identify.
Yeah, but the psychedelics, I think, facilitated and almost lubricated that 180 shift in who I took myself to be, but they didn't themselves bring that on as a permanent change, a permanent state of affairs. And it was meditation that did. So nowadays, part of my everyday identity is transpersonal. I mean, I have a transpersonal experience of myself and my identity all the time, partly. And that's been brought on by the sustained meditation practice. But
Yes.
the meditation practice, for reasons we might go into later, for 10 years, the first 10 years of it was just hard slog with very little reward, no mystical experiences. And the psychedelics kind of fed that, the side of me that wanted these altered states and actual first person mystical experiences. They kind of provided that, which allowed me to not necessarily seek that through the meditation, but to just faithfully pursue the practice, the really boring practice. It was relatively boring, but interestingly, it wasn't, in my opinion, the psychedelics that have had the biggest impact on my life. It was the meditation practice. But that, I don't think it needs to take people 10 years to get to that point, like it did me. A lot of the work I do is to save people having to do that they can start from somewhere better at the beginning. You just made me think of that in what you were saying.
Yeah, I agree. There's two first-person experiences there, but you're not sure how to address the identity shift to allow you to really live in the transpersonal.
I think maybe that meditation brings that shift usually in a more gentle and gradual way. I mean, the actual shift for me was an actual event. It happened, but it's a little bit like a fruit ripening, and then when it's ripe, it's ripe. But it's the ripening happens one drip at a time. It's like compound interest or something. So when that shift actually happens, it's not quite as disorientating as the full-blown psychedelic states are. It's kind of difficult to bring who you are during a full-blown psychedelic experience back into the everyday, going to work on Monday and driving your car and all that kind of thing. Whereas it's a little bit easier to do that with a meditation. I mean, maybe it's something to do with that. I don't know.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. You can do your meditation for an hour before you go to work and be driving on the road totally safe and end up at work with at least a good start for the day. But you couldn't do that on a daily basis unless you were in a shamanic society with your job as not. For me, I do film set building, so I have to use heavy machinery and sharp tools. I would be better off having a different occupation if it was living in a different society. Yeah, but I know what you mean. Reality has to wrap back around us, and we're in the modern world, and it can be a challenge balancing those two experiences. And I think you're right that the meditation helps us marinate in those states in a gentler way and get used to them, and it also gives the possibility of mixing practice, being able to meditate on and off the cushion, whereas that could be all very precarious if you were trying to do the pure psychedelic shamanic route. In fact, it would almost be you would be missing some tools if you were having to do it completely that way. But there is some cultures that have that science and that folk science and that technology, and they've done it. But for us, it's different.
Well, I don't know, but there may be some practices that in the societies you're talking about, they may have some correlative practices that go alongside the shamanic practices, which are more that kind of long-term drip, drip, drip thing over time.
Yes.
So I don't know that for sure, but we in the West, we've kind of plucked practices out of their contexts and used them, and sometimes that has not gone well. But I mean, we're in the process of creating something new now in the West, and that's what I'm excited about and what these conversations are about. And so you going forwards in your story,
So yeah, the first year I was at Liverpool, my girlfriend at the time, we were both very into yoga, and it was going to be cheaper for us to get our student loan at Easter time, go to buy a plane ticket to India. We both wanted to go to India. So we both bought a plane ticket to India, and we had about sort of £400 or £500 to live on for 3 months in India. And if we'd stayed in England, it would maybe been a case of signing on the dole, or living back with your parents, and going to India and surviving off living very, very cheaply seemed a better option. So we both encouraged each other, and we teamed up and went to India. And had a very interesting time, lived very frugally, went to Dharamsala, to the Tibetan refugee community there. And at the end of our trip, we bumped into somebody that suggested that we tag along with them and come to a festival called the Kumbh Mela.
Oh,
and,
wow.
And I said, oh, what's the Kumbh Mela? They said, oh, it's like a sadhu's version of Glastonbury, but it goes on for 3 months. And there's maybe 10 million people there. And okay. So we got on a train and went to one of the 4 Mela sites, is a place called Nasik. And we spent a week, I guess, being sort of guests, taken care of. And it's almost like being, anthropologists, or reverse anthropology. Just turn up there, be humble, fit in and see what's happening. And it was a fascinating week. And we had we'd rescued a dog en route, a small puppy. And when we got to the Kumbh Mela, this restricted on who would give us accommodation. And all of the spiritual traditions are there with their encampments, that almost like a refugee camp stroke Glastonbury. And the person that we traveled with took us to the Hare Krishna camp because they had a lot of Westerners there. But the Hare Krishna wouldn't let us in because of the dog. They had a religious prohibition against dogs. So we were stuck with this puppy. We were nursing back to health. And then somebody said, oh, we'll take you further down the river. I know a sadhu camp. They're very open. They're nice. They'll be fine. And we got taken to a sadhu camp. And the very colourful collection of sadhus from different groups were there. So we found out later this was a sadhu camp for people that didn't get on with their gurus, and they'd all collected together in a mixed camp with a very open guru that was happy to have these sort of orphan spiritual children that didn't get on with their spiritual teachers. So it was a real mixture of people from many, many different groups. But all very open, and they took this dog on and looked after it and were fascinated by it. It was like a new mascot for their camp. So we spent the very interesting week with the sadhus. And there was a number of Western sadhus there. There's some part-time sadhus, Indian sadhus that have been sadhus for 10 years, then dropped back into life and had gone to various foreign countries. And sometimes they were coming back, just visiting their spiritual guru, reconnecting. A Canadian sadhu and a sadhu from Texas who were just part-timers that would come in for the Kumbh Mela festival, maybe spend a year in India researching, carrying on research they started many years ago. And so there was a really nice collection of people that and also the main sadhus of the group that we were staying with, who were carrying on their spiritual practices on a daily basis. And their practices were meditations, sitting around the fire, singing bhajans. The most entertaining was hearing all of the songs and then taking turns in small groups to sing various songs. Sometimes the songs would be in English. My Canadian friend Govinda had written a lot of songs in English dedicated to Ram and to Hanuman. And so at any festival, it's really the music that carries you through the experience. And if the music wasn't happening, festivals would be like refugee camps. And that's even in a traditional festival where people are singing a cappella. There's not a sound system there. There's people singing a cappella around the fire. So it really sort of realized how accessible devotional singing and spiritual singing was, and anybody can really enjoy it. It's the most democratic, accessible, creative way of group meditation. And you go, okay, so this is why singing is so popular in religions around the world. And it was really interesting to see these excellent meditators have such a high appreciation for singing. And
yeah, just going back to my time in school, the singing we did in church was the only thing I enjoyed about religion.
Yeah,
and that was the only thing that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, you know.
yes. Which is a like a first person phenomena where you're feeling something spiritual in a way, aren't you? Or it's moving you, or it's affecting your energy body in a certain way. Yeah. I also, through Sunday school and things, had similar moments where I overcame myself of being too cool for school and got into the singing and experienced some of that hair raising and the heartwarming spirit of the song. Would be a palpable experience, and so it was nice to reconnect with that, and with via the sort of sadhu experience, and realize we're not too cool for school, and we can get into it and embrace it and understand it as a really powerful technique that so many traditions, both spiritual and religious, rely on.
But it really aids memorization.
Yes.
And so many of the really pithy spiritual texts from Hinduism and non-dual Shiva Tantra and the Tibetans that you encountered up in Dharamsala,
Yes.
They chant these texts regularly as songs, but they are, if you were to read them, they seem like really dense philosophical statements or texts. It'd be a bit like somebody putting Nietzsche to song.
Yes.
Or, in the West.
The same subtle use of language that's conveying a very important point that might include an identity shift within it.
We do have that, the kind of the Latin singing in Catholic services and stuff, but it's quite impenetrable. The actual mystical and philosophical content of those services is quite inaccessible. Whereas if you were to translate some of these things that people singing at the Kumbh Mela into English, some of it is straight philosophy.
Yes.
And
philosophy, yes.
Yeah. Without, I mean, there are cultural barriers to us understanding. Some of the references are specific to India or Tibet. But I think that was one of the things that when I first encountered Eastern religions coming, as a Westerner, that was what I enjoyed. That's what I recognized and was drawn to when I first came across them, was that at the heart of it is serious philosophy and psychology and mystical experiences. It's all out there in the open there. And it's like, they're always talking about that. There's loads of books on it. And whereas in Christianity, I know it's there now because I've been able to come back to it. But at the time, I would have had to have dug so deep or been extremely lucky, to come across somebody in that kind of context, in the Christian context.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience. I can look back once, sort of understanding bhakti that is aimed at referencing mythological gods and goddesses, and then there's a type of bhakti singing which is sometimes formless bhakti, which is pointing out instruction hidden within songs for different identity shifts. And as you say, this was almost heretical within Christianity. Many of the very good Christian mystics that are approaching a non-duality had a lot of trouble being accused of being heretics by going too much into that formless direction.
Oh yeah, and burned at the stake.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So the one that comes to mind is the Reinhardt, 14th century Reinhardt mystic, Meister Eckhart, who had to go in front of like a religious court and defend and withdraw some of his statements because they were going way beyond Christianity into a universal formlessness that made certain Catholic people uncomfortable. But it's there, and some prodigious people were just managing to get up there. And
yeah, well, Meister Eckhart, he got away with his life, didn't he? I think if I remember correctly, he was sort of famous enough to be. It would have been a problem to imprison him for life, or burn him at the stake. So they condemned his writing to hell.
Yes,
but not the man.
Not the man. Yes.
Yeah, Julian of Norwich. I mean, there's Teresa of Avila. There's lots of
Yes.
Of Christian mystics who are incredible. But
Yeah.
I mean, I only learned about those in my 20s. And I was out of that Christian context by that time.
And they're still relatively unknown, some of them. Sometimes somebody will give you a tip of like, oh, have you seen this particular one? And you go, oh, okay. There's one particular one that Douglas Harding was really fond of. Somebody, Trahan or something. Really obscure to track down. But again, it was another mystic that in our own culture, we know our own culture really badly. And it still goes on with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's 20th century mystical writings. He was asked not to publish them whilst he was alive, and they were still on a Catholic do not read this, do not give this to teenagers list, until more recently. Now the current Pope is quite pro Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the phenomena of man, and but it just takes a while sometimes, a long time in some traditions.
Yeah.
Get accepted and things to open up.
So like you, I went to India. I've been to India 3 times, and I came back a different person. I'd seen things there that I'd never seen in my country.
Yeah.
And it was a very, very condensed period of worldly education.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was a bit younger than you. I was only 18 when I went, and the first time, and it was, yeah. I mean, I came back a different person. So we're sort of at that point in your story at the Kumbh Mela.
Yeah. Well, I'll sort of jump on a little bit. I returned to 3 more Melas after that, or 2 more Melas. I've been to 3 Melas. So there was a Mela the following year that I could make it to by, again, leaving college at Easter time and staying in India until October when college started again. So I went to the second Mela in Ujjain, stayed with the same sadhus again, got to know them a little bit better. And then 2-3 years after that, it was the next Mela. There's 4 Melas in a 12-year cycle. So I caught the next Mela at Allahabad, found the same sadhus and stayed with them again. So for sort of 3 consecutive Melas, I stayed with the same people, just getting to know them a little bit. And one of the most interesting things was asking them what their practice was. And their practices, in a way, were very integral, that they would, because they're full-time, a lot of them are full-time, they have got time to study the Upanishads and the Vedantic texts. They've got time to be pretty good at their own version of Hatha Yoga that they've taken on to keep themselves sort of fit and supple. Their devotional practices are expected. If you turn up at somebody's fire and join them, you will be expected to sing a song at some point. So they, in a very strange sort of way, the modern sadhus are expected to sort of cover quite a variation, and then to sometimes major in one of these areas, go more heavily into ascetic meditation, or go more heavily into studying the Upanishads or things like that. So they sort of decide and negotiate with their guru what it's going to be.
But they, you know, they have the tradition of karma yoga, raja yoga, bhakti yoga, and jnana yoga. So, you know, those four together make a very integrated path,
yes.
yoga. But of course, you know, no one's going to be an expert in all four of those.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some rare individuals might be, but, you know, people will go down one line or the other. But at least in India, those four paths are kind of, everybody knows about those four paths. And
yes, it's not unusual.
yeah.
It's more the norm for those people. So that was very interesting. And also another thing that had a great effect on me, their sadhus and their practice, their sadhana is their practice, and they tend to do it on a daily basis. And this is the best thing that happened to me, realizing what sadhana was, that it could be constructed, put together, negotiated, and you could have various practices that you engaged with on a daily basis or every few days, and you could have this long ongoing project with a little sort of sub-interest. So that was the nicest thing that happened to me. I sort of got into sadhana, just having a space in my life to give myself a couple of time slots, a time slot in the morning and a time slot in the evening, where whatever I was interested in, I would do that then, a meditation in the morning and some yoga at evening time, and then read some books. So it was an early version, I guess, of what I later learned to appreciate, more refined version of it as an integral approach. But it was nice to know that it was there in Indian culture. It's there in the work of sort of Gurdjieff. Sometimes has orientation towards, you know, belly, mind, heart, and mind. So you tend to get a triangle. Whereas the integral stuff gives us more than a triangle. It gives us a square or any extras that we want. You know, we don't have to restrict it just to a triangle. But just having space in my life, some time windows to have an ongoing practice, whatever that was, and if that changed. That was also fine. One of the first practices I was given by my sadhu friends was a mantra, an Om Namo Bhagavati Vasudeva mantra, which is a Krishna mantra. And they gave me the wrong information. The guy who gave me it told me it was the goddess of wealth and abundance. And I think he's wanting a big tip. And but I had that mantra as a mantra that I would practice and play around with for a long time. And after about 1994, I ended up going on a Goenka Vipassana retreat. I'd only ever done like hour-long meditations at the most on my own at home, or usually it was a 20-minute meditation, was as much as I could cope with. And then I would find that occasionally if I took magic mushrooms, I could sit there for a 6-hour session. It's giving me the concentration and the body-mind flexibility to just sit there. So the most intense meditations I had would be like 6-hour meditations with the sort of help from the psilocybin mushrooms. And then I booked myself into a Vipassana retreat, and that's round about 10 to 12 sitting meditations a day. I think you've also done the same Vipassana retreat, the Goenka one. So you were only ever sitting for 1 hour, and then it's a 20-minute walk or a food break, which is a really, really nice way of breaking up meditation. And then you find, because everyone is doing it, everyone has the capacity to meditate for an hour, have a walk, meditate for an hour, have a tea break. If you have a break in between your hour slots, you can keep on going, and everyone is capable of doing this sort of strange regime of 10 1-hour sits a day with the 20-minute breaks in between, which is quite something, because you wouldn't feel like you had that ability because everyone's there and there's nothing else is happening. you get with the program and go with it.
I think interestingly, a lot of people I've had these conversations with have been on the Vipassana retreats. They're very accessible, they're affordable because
Yes.
you pay what you can, and it's very well run, very efficient, and they can take large numbers of people in one go. One of my main criticisms of the Vipassana retreats is they never ask the question who. So you spend 10 days, most of every day for 10 days, carefully observing things going on in your body, whether it's your around your nostrils, your chest, body scans, but they never open up the inquiry into who is the one making that observation. And I mean, this gets back to what I was saying about the first 10 years of my meditation practice were just this kind of grind of boredom, because I know even though I mean, I'll get into this later probably, but I mean, I had access to all sorts of amazing teachings from Tibet and India and stuff, but because of the cultural barrier, the cultural references in these texts, some of the linguistics of it, and also some of the bad translations by Westerners too, were diverting me away from actually asking that question. And so, after 10 years, I came across, it was actually some pointing out instructions in one of Ken Wilber's books that were basically like Tibetan Dzogchen pointing out instructions, but written by someone who was an American person in English. English was his first language. He knew how to communicate to white people like me, or whatever, or English speakers or whatever. And for the first time I asked that really simple question, and it all fell into place. And that's one of the things, if I mean, this is one of the reasons why I like Dzogchen, and we might get into this later, is that they present you with that
as part of
right at the beginning. And I think my misfortune was to not encounter a Western Dzogchen teacher early on. That's what I could. I mean, I was going to see loads of Tibetan teachers, but it was very difficult to penetrate what they were talking about because of the cultural barrier. And if I had met a Western Dzogchen teacher right at the outset, it wouldn't have taken me 10 years to have my first person experience of formless awareness. And again, it's my critique, and Sam Harris has talked about it a lot. Someone I quite like his podcast, and he's got a good waking up app, meditation app. So he also was saying how he did years and years of Vipassana retreats. He did 3-month-long retreats, and years and years of this practice. But then it wasn't until he encountered Dzogchen that he had this realization of his own formless identity. And he was like, oh, if only I'd come across this earlier, because all those years I was just seeking, basically. And so that was I came away from the Vipassana retreat. I mean, I knew all of this stuff before I went in there, so I was actually kind of doing I was adding my own things to the practice I was doing on the Vipassana retreat. I wasn't strictly following Goenka's instructions because I found them too limiting. And I mean, what's your view on
I had a similar experience where I was following the program, and so the first unusual thing that happened was I was struggling with following the program and struggling with the silence, and then it got very painful and very energetically intense after about 3 days, and I sort of remembered one of the sadhus that we'd stayed with at the Kumbh Mela, who was 10 years into a 12-year practice. And this 12-year practice is a Muli Baba practice. They don't speak for 12 years.
Wow.
So I'd met this person who drawn in the sand for me and communicated. I would talk to him and he'd do doodles in the sand. And there was, in the last 2 years of his 12-year silent retreat, and he came to mind, and that helped me get with the program of the sort of non-conceptual awareness, almost like I picked up a little taste or smell or whiff of the state off him, and it allowed me to sort of accept, and it gave me a tiny little inroad, and it allowed me to sort of get with the practice. And then I found after another, it got more intense. I thought, okay. And they were saying, stick with the felt sensation. And then I started having a lot of luminosity arising, and it sort of replayed to me my middle pillar meditations from my previous experience. And so it was like strange things were turning up in the space that the Vipassana was creating that weren't always Vipassana, but they were just coming up anyway, and I could see them. I could take them as something that was getting in the way, or just something that was turning up and needed to sort of express itself. So I just took the latter, that it needed to express itself. And I had some very intense visual experiences which were as strong as my strongest psychedelic experiences, and I could identify it as in the eyes closed state. Everything became very luminous on the central channel, and then the whole space opened up as very, very fast moving psychedelic looking see-through transparent sort of vision of it was just the face of a deity like Krishna, with running through its meridians, had language running through its meridians. And I think it's almost like a psychedelic vision that refused to stay in one tradition. It could be Krishna, it could be Hermes, it could be Thoth. It was just like a sort of mystical vision of a language deity. Like the bringer of language, with almost like tattoo language in language that I couldn't recognize, like flowing through its meridians and things. And it sort of eventually spun up and went sort of very bright white light. But I was really shocked that I could have equally as intense experiences under certain conditions without anything on the outside. So this is quite a shock to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised that you went on to get into Tibetan Buddhism, because
Yes.
they've got plenty of room in Tibetan Buddhism for those kind of visionary experiences.
Yes.
Tibetan Buddhism is more tantric type of spiritual practice than straight Vipassana.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I don't want to sound too down on Vipassana. I think it's a great practice, and it's doing great work in the world, and it's a lot of people's inroad into spiritual practice.
Yes.
And I think if done properly, with a few little, there are people out there teaching what we might call integral Vipassana, or a more complete Vipassana is a more complete spiritual path.
Yes.
But those kind of experiences aren't really taken as, the type of visionary experience you're talking about isn't taken seriously.
No.
In that more Hinayana Buddhist context.
Yeah.
I know Vipassana is a technique that is applied, through the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Tantric, and Dzogchen. It's a kind of universal technique, but as an actual tradition, they're not really interested in all of that stuff.
No, they want to they have another agenda, which is an important agenda, but as you say, that could almost be seen as an illusory distraction in a way. I mean, I was happy that I just let them run their course, and they cleared, and it was the same host space in which my normal awareness and the vision, I did manage to take that away and go, oh, okay, so this is what they want in the Vipassana. The actual host space is more important than anything that turns up in it. Like the transpersonal experience, knowing of the experience is more important than any of the phenomena that can arise in it. So yes, I found that I wasn't able to talk about it, and it wasn't really their area if I did want to talk to it about it. And it wasn't till I got in the direction of the Tibetan and the Dzogchen, which they go, oh yeah, we know about, and yes, and we use that in the Mahayana. They will use that rather than see it as a distraction, but it's a slightly different program than the original Hinayana. It's a bit more juicy, and it does, the Tibetans really embraced what they could do with those visualizations and the energetics. So I did have to sort of find my way to that in a way. And the Vipassana, I really appreciate it as an opening, and it was completely authentic and true, their orientation. But yeah, if I'd wanted to talk about any of them visual experiences, it would have just stick with the program, and you know, you'll get that. Yeah, it wouldn't have even been seen as that important, which is okay. They got their agenda, and yeah.
So when was it around this time that you started doing Tai Chi training?
Well,
Qigong.
Yeah, so I came out of that Vipassana, and because I'd experienced so much of the visual luminosity, I don't know whether you remember, but near the end of the Vipassana, they ask you to sort of, instead of just scanning the body, they ask you to sort of take some lines down. It's just a subtle part of the instruction that say, yeah, you could try, you know, taking a line down. When I started taking the lines down and things, it sort of brought me back into the sort of subtle energy body. And I finished off my Vipassana by having some more intense sort of chi experiences. And sometimes experiences where it felt like I didn't have a body. So they weren't body orientated. They were just body-mind. It got used to itself and could hold itself up. And a few sort of cessations, that when I would come out of the cessation, it would bring on a lot of visual things to try and explain why it had happened. And I came out of that with a real interest of what's this Qigong thing? Is this an area that they specialize and deal with? So I came out of that, and I started investigating. I kept on the meditation, and I thought, investigate this Qigong direction a little bit more. So just asked around and followed people's advice, and experienced a couple of different Qigong systems. One is Bruce Francis. He does his water method, and it's very influenced by Vipassana. Bruce Francis's Chinese teacher, his name will come to me in a minute, he apparently had spent time as a Vipassana teacher in China. And then it affected his style of teaching Tai Chi from a very awareness point of view. So again, the visual phenomena wasn't necessarily a big part of it, but the sort of awareness of the somatic self and the ability to witness that was high on the agenda. Lots of standing meditation. And then I was still intrigued by this visual side, so I did go and investigate with the help of a friend who was very familiar with Mantak Chia's practice, which has some similarities with Tibetan Buddhism, and is maybe influenced, or it's a type of Taoism that is has traded skills possibly with Tibetan Buddhism. And strangely enough, Bruce Francis was very anti he was the water school of awareness, and the Mantak Chia school was the fire school of the visualization. And they're antagonistically convinced that each one is not a legitimate path, or they have a criticism of each other's a fire approach or water approach. And I found them both interesting, so I did them both and settled my own differences with them. And then after a time, I thought I want to tackle something a little bit more challenging, and so I expressed an interest in 1990 with wanting to check out Tai Chi. And purely by chance, a friend took me along, introduced me to a teacher. My wife was also interested, so we both started Tai Chi with a teacher that had been recommended by a friend, and it turned out to be this Wudang practical Tai Chi. And it has a very sort of serious system of Neigong and Qigong standing meditation, but you're not allowed to learn it until about 3 years into the practice. So we had to learn like the short form and the long form. And then after about 3 years, I started the Neigong practice. And the Neigong practice was done a little bit like the sadhus treat their sadhana. It was to be done on a daily basis. And they sometimes choose to do it for 100 days as a project, to try and be a bit scientific about it, a bit committed, and set yourself a project of like, sort of 3-month practice. So I was really intrigued. That fitted my sadhana thing, and I kept with that and moved in that direction, and ended up learning the Neigong, which was a bit more demanding than the Qigong that I'd learned. So that's why they insisted that I sort of sorted myself out by learning the short form and the long form. And then I started the Neigong. I was quite fit, and I found there was a big improvement in my meditation. I could sit for longer. So when I went back and did some meditation retreats, I found it so much easier, because I'd had that sort of 6, 7, 8 years of doing the Qigong, and it had worked its magic, and I could sit for a lot stabler and a lot better. So I thought, oh yeah, that long haul thing of doing the Qigong, even the Qigong that's not giving you any visual or mystical experiences, just the commitment to doing it regularly, it sort of straightened a lot of stuff out for me. So that was made me feel that sometimes just being quiet and humble and sticking with the daily practice and sticking with it and working through it.
It's quite common in in America and Europe and the West for people don't really like, they see long-term practice as not sexy. It's not that bang thing, there is a partial truth to that. I mean, I think it's a little bit like in Buddhism. In Zen, you've got the sudden and the gradual path, and they kind of like to think that one's better than the other. The gradual path being people that they're the tradition where they just do lots and lots and lots of sitting meditation for years and years and years and years, and then the sudden path is more of that Rinzai koan practice, more that looking for the flash of awakening and insight, and they tend to sort of take the piss out of each other, for their shortcomings. And when you've got an integrating mind like you and I have, and the people I'm having these conversations with, you sort of, you look at that and you think, oh, come on, guys, because this is both of these are important, so what I was referring to in the Western culture of that want it all now, that might be more of that kind of sudden awakening thing. But if that's all you've got, then there's a whole other thing which is brought through that faithful, dedicated, drips in the bucket thing. You don't even notice what's happening, and then suddenly, before you know it, some major transformations happens.
Yeah.
But if you only do that kind of this kind of you can get the faithful repetitive practice, you can get into a rut.
Yes.
Where no awakening is going to happen, because
Yeah.
you're just repeating the same thing over and over again. The tradition you're doing it in will just confirm that and encourage you to just keep going, and you can go through your whole life without ever having that flash of insight that this southern school is bringing to. So I mean, it's another thing I really like about the Dzogchen tradition, is they do bring those two together very nicely, and it's explicit.
Yes.
You know, and
more explicit than the Zen people in a way. They're not going to mess around with a cone realization. They're just going to tell you what it should look like.
Yeah,
Tell you where to be, in
yeah,
the identity relationship. When I was trying to balance the differences of the Qigong fire school versus the Qigong water school, luckily enough, I came across Ken Wilber's work. And from an integral perspective, you don't have to worry about these arguments. You can test them out in your own laboratory and see what fits for you. So this is a nice thing about it. Maybe 1998, when I was having these quandaries, and with these different ways into meditation, Qigong, Tai Chi, with these different opinionated people that often don't have any experience of the alternative schools anyway. They've just been told by their school that we don't like that school.
It's ignorance. It's just like racism.
Yeah.
I mean, I live in a very rural place, and I have met some people who are very racist. And when I've asked them how many, for example, black people they've actually ever met, none.
It's based on the unknown.
Yeah. So it's so when you have no experience of something, you can just write it off. It's the easiest thing in the world to do that, and you seem like you're really intelligent, that kind of cynicism. It seems to carry some authority and sort of some sense of intelligence with it, but really a lot of the time cynicism is just cynicism for its own sake, or it's a kind of masquerade as actually having some real knowledge about something. You just write it off, oh, that's a load of rubbish. Well, what do you even know about it? Nothing. I mean, I haven't even met anybody or even done any of those practices, but it's just, I don't even want to,
why would I want to? And somebody told me anyway, they're all crap.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking earlier that, when you were saying about to have these magic mushroom experiences, and there was no room for that in these Theosophical Society groups you were going to. And one of the great things about this integral movement is you can take anything in there with you, and people are not going to write it off. Even all of it is in there. I mean, there's even integral bondage, masochist, sadomasochist, kink.
Yes,
that sound really uncool. With the kink culture, there's an integral kink culture, and all of that stuff, psychedelics and psychotherapy, bringing your personalness in there as well as your transpersonal stuff, and it's all welcome. And I think there's a moment when listening to your story so far, sounds very similar to mine and many other people, that you've always been interested in all of this stuff, but each one of these individual schools or lineages, whatever, is saying always right, all of this other stuff is a load of crap, just you should be ignoring it. And you think, it just doesn't really seem right. And then you come across this whole global movement, which actually has 100-year history or more, that is saying, all of this stuff, it's okay, and it's all true, but it's partially true.
Yes.
And you're very welcome to bring all of these things in their own place.
Yeah. I think it comes from a maturity, because looking back now, you can see how anything can be a trial or a meditation, or, almost anything, stubbing your toe, anything. And but I think there was a cultural shift that sort of happened as a consequence of Wilbur and the maturing of some of those teachers that had started with their psychedelic experience in the late 60s, had taken the long haul path, and then got to a point where they understood that a lot of Westerners were misunderstanding the translation, the clunky translation, the use of words. And there was almost a maturing of Wilbur and his peer group, like Dr. Dan Brown from the Pointing Out Way. And the high point of spiritual practice had been sort of misdirected to maybe being like a Kundalini experience, where to see that as like a subtle awakening, and then there was causal realization and non-dual. It almost, those higher levels hadn't been brought into the map in a way, or into the culture. So a lot of people were stopping short or being attracted to the juicier, quicker paths, not realizing that it wasn't really the finish, or it wasn't going to be a satisfactory finish, because you were still not at a place to know the experience. You were still being the experience. So I guess I was sort of immersed in that sort of ocean of not being able to differentiate. And I think through the Wilbur work, and as you say, some of his very straightforward live pointing out instruction that he does in a few of his talks, sort of really makes you aware of the knowing of experience rather than the experience themselves. And then we go, oh, it's okay. So I was in a way maybe enamored by experience, where it could have made me short-sighted. But fortunately, whenever I was sort of questioning that, something would come, like reading a Wilbur book, and realize, oh, okay, there's these other things going on. That only within an integral, if you were lucky enough to have an integral teacher that was going to teach you some Raja Yoga, some straight witnessing meditation, maybe some bhakti, and then really thoroughly allow you to understand the jnani knowledge, or the identity yoga. It would come together for you in a Hindu package.
Well, Sri Aurobindo was, maybe one of the only people around, in that kind of early to mid part of the 20th century who was explicitly teaching that kind of thing.
Yes, they were saying post-nirvanic realization. It's not finished.
He was not famous. I mean, he was quite famous, but not. He didn't have really wide reach. I mean, he's a pretty obscure figure.
Yes.
Now, even. I mean, there's Auroville is quite a bit. I mean, after he died, they created this whole city.
Yes, the mother
his ashram.
The project into Auroville, yeah.
Yeah, but was I going to say so it was around the time in your story now, say around 2000.
Yeah.
A lot of the Western practitioners who started practice in the 60s and 70s, they'd done 30 or 40 years worth of practice in these traditions, and they were actually becoming awakened,
Yes,
just as much as the Tibetan or Indian or Japanese gurus and teachers. So, but before that time, if you there were kind of less Westerners. I mean, I think this is kind of the problem I encountered was, I think around that time I was very much in the postmodern worldview, and I thought, white people were ridiculous, and modern people and no English or American people could be as enlightened as these Tibetan
Mm.
teachers or Indian gurus I was studying. So that the only option I had was to go to these Tibetan teachers, and have that thing of that cultural mismatch, and also I was working with the only people I thought were worth reading were these ethnographers that went off in the 1930s, and times like that, who some of their translations were really bad. It's a translation is best done by someone who's actually had their own awakening.
Yes, is doing the practice.
Yeah, and a lot of these people it was obvious they didn't understand what they were trying. They were linguists, really, with a kind of philosophical interest, and they were translating this stuff. And so, I was experiencing all of these barriers to having my own first person experience of what I was studying. I mean, I was studying this at university.
You were at the SOAS course, yeah.
At SOAS,
yeah,
which was an institution built on all of that ethnographic study I was just describing, and linguistics and all that, languages. So it was quite a frustrating time for me because I could intuit what was there, and I was having these first person experiences through the psychedelics, the different psychedelics I was taking, but I couldn't quite marry them up until later when I came across the integral stuff.
Yes. Well, one of the big reliefs was me. I read Ken Wilber's Sex, Ecology and Spirituality, and in the appendix of that book, the very large appendix of footnotes, Ken Wilber talked about the psychedelic experience and the subtle visual phenomenology as being authentic and the same as what people sometimes experience in the meditation halls. So for me, he sort of legitimized it, even though because of his Buddhist orientation, he wasn't participating in it, but he had enough friends from his generation and his peer group that had been there and done that, and also become meditators. So it had both the psychedelic and the non-psychedelic version of this. So this was a nice confirmation. I could sort of relax and stop questioning it and just see it as phenomenology. Rather than, is it a hallucination? Is it real or is it not real? It's just phenomenology. It's just something that occurs that somebody could interview you about, And so this was something coming from Wilber, that he was from that, seeing it all as the knower experience and the experience, and whatever, it's all true but partial. So it sort of saved the day. It wasn't the ultimate, and it maybe wasn't the final aim, but it was true but partial. So
I'm just aware of the time. We got half an hour to cover 20 years.
Okay, so from it's quite easy to do. We can skip through this. Okay, so another interesting break I had in 1999 because of my mushroom interests. A friend said to me, "Oh, it's a Brazilian group that do a very structured version of ayahuasca ceremony. They're called Santo Daime, and they've existed for 80 years now in Brazil, and they're so structured that they won the legal right to use ayahuasca for spiritual and religious use in Brazil, and along with another group, the UDV, have that status." And so I went along to my first ayahuasca session, and for me, all I could do was to sit and meditate and have this experience. And the people, the Brazilians, could sit and sing very eloquently and play very complex musical instruments. They'd learn a different skill level whilst they were in this sort of state. So I was quite impressed by their music skill and the fact that they could sing so well and sing better than well, sing amazingly, and I could hardly stand. And then the final 2 hours of the work, they got us all to stand up, and they showed us a very simple march to the left, march to the right, march to the left. They're like almost like a Qigong dance. And the last 2 hours of the work, in time with the music that they were singing, the whole room separated men and women. The whole group would march to the left and then march to the right, and the room oscillated with the women moving one way and the men moving the other way. So it was the first time I'd ever experienced a real structure within a psychedelic work, other than just sitting and meditating.
And also ayahuasca tends to be group work.
Yes.
It's uncommon for people to do it on their own, for example.
No, you need that peer pressure to help you swallow the stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why it lends itself to being done in a group.
Yes.
Whereas mushrooms are, are much more amenable to, being on your own. So when you're in a group's okay, but I mean, it's also all right to do that on your own.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I sort of hung in there, and I learned a lot about how a structured singing, dancing, sometimes strict meditation, sometimes concentration works that they would do, where there would be very little singing and we'd just meditate for long periods of time. And then they'd sing a song and then sit and meditate for another 40 minutes. So they were doing concentration works, with basically sitting meditation works with a few songs. At other times they would do festijar works, which were celebrations, where once they'd got us up singing and dancing, eventually they would do 8-hour works where they're singing over 100 songs, and the whole works are done singing and dancing, which I needed all the stamina from my Tai Chi training to keep up with these people, whether it was sat meditating or singing, dancing. And
this was a Christian church I needed when I was a teenager.
And one of the beautiful ceremonial ritual aspects of it, that they're Brazilian, not Roman Catholics, they're from a syncretic folk Catholicism. So they align themselves with the indigenous Amazonian culture, with the freed black slave spiritual culture, with the African spiritual culture that came with the slave movement, and with the Christian saints and the Christian angelic archetypes of Christian mysticism, and in no way connected themselves with Rome. So it's like, if you bring Catholicism to this country that already takes psychedelics, you're bound to at some point get a psychedelic religion that's doing it its own way. So there's
something similar has happened with psilocybin mushrooms in Central America and Christianity.
Yes, so very similar, where indigenous, a syncretism between indigenous and angelic entities, Catholic saints, a perfect blend. And for me, this was really, I was getting quite into perennial philosophy. So this is like a type of syncretic perennialism. And some very wonderful experiences. And I didn't have the time or the money to go and do meditation retreats. I couldn't afford the time and the money, so I wasn't able to do them. So me able to go along to a Santo Daime work and within a one-day event have an intense experience that that encouraged me in all of my efforts that I was making in the Tai Chi and the meditation, and gave me encouragement to continue. So I was able to tap into the ayahuasca and use them as like mini retreats that happened within one day or within 2 days, which I did have the time for, and it was done by donation, so I did have the money for it. So it was like discovering a Vipassana that happened in 8 hours. You could fit into your weekends, and I sort of stuck with this for a long time and got a lot out of it. And it was a wonderful experience to have how movement, singing, meditation fits from an indigenous perspective and in a lineage that's 80 years old. What technology have they integrated into their moving and stilling and meditation in relationship to their sacrament? the ayahuasca. And from that, I thought, I read the Wilbur stuff, and I thought I need to get a bit more serious here. And all of that experience, I brought the visual stuff back. And like you say, in the Hinayana tradition, the visions are not a huge thing, but in Tibetan Buddhism and Dzogchen, they're a big part of the practice. So that was my program. I stuck with that for all the way for the next 10 years, basically. It's Tai Chi, meditation, the opportunity to do ayahuasca. And then around 2011, I don't mind saying this because it was in the papers anyway. The Santo Daime were taken to court and warned and told that they couldn't function anymore in the UK. And that was very sad, and it was hard for people.
Yeah. And yeah, well, I mean, up till that point, the legal status of ayahuasca was kind of unset. I mean, it was, nobody really knew where it stood, in places like the UK.
Yeah. So there was the first, as you say, the first time that the authorities had made a stand about it. And so I thought, I'm not going to let this. I went and did, at that point, I went and I thought, I've been reading the Wilbur stuff for 10 years now. I need to check I've got it right. It's so easy to misinterpret things. So I found out that they were running an MA course at the JFK University in San Francisco, and it had the option of doing like a year and a half or something, and doing a certificate, or if you could hold out for 3 years, there was an MA at the end of it. But the pace of it was quite full on, and the workload was sort of 25 hours study a week, and I was doing it on top of a day job. So I managed to survive for a year and a half with a lot of help from my wife. And I did 8 subjects, 2 subjects a quarter, 2 papers to write at the end of it. The next quarter, another 2 subjects, write a paper. So I managed to write 8 papers, and got a feel for what I'd misunderstood, what I'd understood, and had great opportunity to have a lot of peer feedback of people getting their heads around it. So it was one of the best investments I made. And then as I came out of that, I realized I couldn't keep up and do the full MA. I thought, what is the one thing I would like to do to focus on? And it was to come back to the meditation, to ask those lecturers and my peers, who's one of the top people that can explain this stuff to Westerners? I might also have some misunderstanding in the translation. I felt there was something missing, and people kept saying, oh, Dr. Daniel Brown from the Pointing Out Way tradition. He wrote a book with Wilbur and Engelman, where they covered 5 different traditions. They covered, I think it was Christian mysticism, Hinduism, perhaps Buddhism, and perhaps Zen. But basically they looked at the developmental sequence rather than the detail of those 4 different traditions, and saw very, very specific correlations. So even though they bitch about each other and accuse each other of not getting it right, they all go through the same developmental sequences with people that stick with the program over a long period of time.
Was that the book called Transformations of Consciousness?
That's it, Transformation of Consciousness.
Yeah, I think I tried to find that and couldn't find it.
Right.
This was a long time ago. It might be easier to find now, but
it's a very technical book, but very interesting. It went out of print because there was some of Wilbur's ideas have moved on. Then they got permission to, I think you can get it as a free PDF.
Right.
Or a second hand.
But that, what you have described there is a really important recognition that all these different spiritual traditions seem on the surface to be so different from each other, incompatible. But if you kind of look beneath the surface features, they have these progressions along the path looks very similar in all of them.
Yes.
And once you know that scheme, so a classic example of it might be the 10 ox herder pictures from Zen. And once you understand that, you can plug any religious tradition into that. So you could then practice Christian meditation through that same schema.
Yeah.
And my own practice, I kind of started off with the Tibetan Buddhist stuff, but then when I came across this underlying pattern that I could then see that in all of these other religious spiritual traditions, and I've actually landed more back with practices that are more to do with my own culture. So I do I do kind of straight Dzogchen meditations of formless awareness type meditations, Dharmakaya type thing. But I also do what you might call tantric visualization deity yoga practices, but I don't use Tibetan deities because they don't mean anything to me.
Yes.
I mean, this was something I ran up against when I was studying this academically, and I was very much into the Tibetan thing. These practices, I knew they were important and they resonated with me, but the deities I was studying and trying to visualize all their ornaments and ritual objects and all that stuff, it had no cultural resonance with me at all. I was having to generate that myself, and it was an enormous amount of effort. Whereas now I do basically the same practice that follows the same scheme.
Yes.
But I do it more with the kind of English rural goddess type.
Some archetypes that you recognize.
So, well, that's it. I'm drawing on archetypes that, I mean, and even Star Wars was the mythology I grew up with, and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. So those kind of archetypes are more what I can draw on in a tantric practice. But if I said that to a traditional Tibetan teacher, they would just laugh in my face, and tell me I was like a little child playing in a sandbox. But I don't need to have now. I don't need to have a Tibetan teacher come and confirm my practice.
Yes.
I don't need that anymore.
Yeah.
But there was a time when I was very much worried about that kind of thing. But I've all let that go. So I think
they're like Star Wars and things are our folk culture, our generation's folk culture, and our postmodern myths.
Yeah,
Hero's journey.
Well, Yoda is for me. Yoda is a better embodiment of Avalokiteshvara than Shenrizig is in Tibetan. That kind of wise, compassionate, or maybe he might be more like Manjushri or something. I don't know, but but the reason why I bring that up is that this kind of that's almost like a mental academic practice, searching for these underlying structures and developmental sequences and paths that apply in all of these circumstances. And once you've kind of taken that out, you've got almost like a universally applicable tool there.
Yes.
But that is literally blasphemy to the religious traditions you're doing that to.
Yes. Spiritual syncretism is is heretical in a way, because you're bringing your neighbours' archetypes and bringing them to the barbecue in a way.
Well, I mean, that's actually, it's funny because all of these religious traditions have done their own form of syncretism, but they've just choose to ignore it or maybe forgotten.
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
you know,
they did it.
Tibetan Buddhism, for example, is a syncretism of the Indian tantric Buddhism and Tibetan pre-Buddhist shamanic techniques.
Yes, the Bon tradition. So they,
and also the Buddhist tradition that was taken to Tibet was also a kind of syncretism of Hinduism plus a few other things, and I mean Hinduism wasn't even a thing, that was a colonial term, but anyway, we digress. But I mean, I think it's a very powerful moment when you realize that there is something underlying all of this. We don't like the intellectual activity like that. Is kind of like, people don't like that in spirituality. It's like it's almost they think of the Industrial Revolution and logic and reason and destroying the planet, but get that away from my spirituality. I don't know.
We have a difficulty with the soul and the archetypes. Jung tried to devise some way in which Westerners could be comfortable about them, and other places like in India and in South America, they just get on with it. With their neighbours' archetypes and their archetypes as sort of historic representations of each other. I mean, for me, it got me beyond I did a lot of cultural healing, I think, and overcome a lot of resistance and understood the tears and the struggles of indigenous cultures and things like that by singing their songs to their archetypes of Pachamama and Pretivelos, the wise old black man and the wise old black woman, very sort of powerful archetypes. It was so unusual for the life expectancy of a slave in Brazil was about 8 years. So to end up with wise old black married couples, they normally didn't used to make it into old age. So Peto Velos is a wise old black man. Mama Velos is a wise old black woman. But just taking those on and experiencing them through songs, there's a lot of, it created a cosmopolitan, perennial spiritual identity for me that could go beyond a lot of the postmodern problems and issues and things like that. And I think you mentioned it before, you have to recognize the positive creative contributions of Western culture, indigenous cultures, whatever culture, and focus on the best of it, and rather than the worst of it at some point in your critique of the world.
And, well, a lot of it's straw manning, isn't it? You straw man the other world views and say, oh, look at all the rubbish stuff, and then you steel man your own worldview. Take the best parts of your worldview and put it against in an unfair competition against the worst parts of other worldview. Say, oh, look at this, look at this fight. I really would like to hear more about Dan Brown and Dzogchen.
Right, so Dan Brown's was super interesting in that I was very used to Ken Wilber's model, in which they stack up the sort of the hatha yoga, and then the subtle work, and then the causal work, and then the non-dual. And I know that Wilber has questioned this along with Alan Combs, and the Wilber Combs matrix questions the validity of that hierarchical progression, and notices that some cultures were just very, very non-dual orientated, maybe some of the Taoists, and some of them were very subtly orientated, maybe like the Bon, and then some of them were very sort of hatha yoga orientated. And it was presumed that there was a sequence. And when I went to the Dan Brown thing, Dan Brown said that he'd asked Rohab Tulku, his Lama, how best to teach this to Westerners. And Rohab Tulku said, well, Dan, you're going to have to work out which is the best way to teach this to Westerners. And Dan said that one thing that he wanted to alter was the sequence that they were taught in. So this is what I experienced when I turned up to Tibet House, Swiss Cottage in London, which, if Tibet was recognized as a country, it would be the Tibetan, where diplomats would hang out. It would be the embassy, the Tibetan embassy. But because no one in the world recognizes Tibet as a country, it's just Tibet House. And it has a meditation hall there and some Tibetan treatments. And so Dan arrived, and Dan told us about this sort of intuition that it was better off if you teach Westerners the emptiness practices and give them a glimpse of awakening, and then come back around and teach them the preparation practices. So he reversed the teaching order. So the very first 3 days of a Dan Brown retreat is almost back to Vipassana, with 3 days of mindfulness of breath as the object of concentration. And then they take you into some of the Dzogchen pointing out, where they've established the experiencer of the breath. And then from that, the experience of the view and the view, and things like lion's gaze. And I thought, what have they done here? Basically, there's a lot of people in the Hindu tradition, like Papaji, that says, oh, if I was taught jnana yoga first, I might have got along the path quicker. And they're similar to what you were saying, if there were certain things that were taught in a slightly different order, you might save yourself 7 years of slog, because you realize that your position of experiencing the meditation is just is one step too involved in the experience, and the stepping back would allow you to, oh, okay, and then you could come back in. And Dan Brown sort of did that. So this is a general complaint. And these wiser, brighter, integral teachers have sussed on, and some of the traditional teachers have sussed on. And they know that there's a more optimum way, depending on people's personalities maybe. So it's true but partial. But on more Westerners, you can get it to work in a better sequence by changing the order. So you don't sort of just crack on and say hatha yoga, and then subtle energy yoga, and then a causal yoga, and then non-dual yoga. That's the best way to do it. Basically, Dan Brown did some mindfulness of breath, and then dropped into the non-dual emptiness practices. And then they go back into the subtle practices of ways of cleaning up the residual duality that still exists in your own system, which is very peculiar, but for me it worked really well. And then I started recognizing what he'd done, and a lot of in India it's different. There's so many different teachers, and they're all a little bit freelance. They all know this. It's not like a big lineage with a big monastery. And in India they've constantly played around, and some people like Ramana Maharishi did the jnana sort of first, and then went into a really powerful ongoing marinating in the silence, which worked for him. And India's full of people wandering around asking other teachers whether there's a more optimum order in which they could experience and get a clearer picture of what's going on in a way. So it happens in India, it happens for us Westerners, and maybe it's just trying to find the right order of teaching sequence that suits your personality type. Who knows what it is?
And just, for anyone who's listening, who doesn't know Dan Brown, I think he calls himself Daniel P. Brown, probably to distinguish him from some other the author of the Da Vinci Code.
Yes.
Yeah. So Daniel P. Brown is not some irresponsible, disrespectful, Western academic who's gone in and ruined some perfect
Yes.
Tibetan. He's studied Tibetan Buddhism for, I think, 50 years or something,
Yes.
and he speaks the Tibetan language and has translated loads of texts. He speaks Sanskrit, and I mean, he is as authentically engaged with this tradition as any Westerner I've ever heard of.
Yes.
So he's tinkering around with this from a place of great reverence and respect and understanding too.
And we can call him Dr. Dan to distinguish him from the Da Vinci Code guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Dr. Dan, when came up with this idea, his root lama was Rohab Tulku, who was head of one of the Bon lineages and had obviously become a refugee. And refugee found himself in America. And Dan had coincidentally shared a room with him back in the early 70s, and then reconnected it with him later. Rohab Tulku's position within the Tibetan spiritual hierarchy is that he was regarded as the living incarnation of Padmasambhava, the historic figure who brought Tibetan Buddhism to Tibet. So Rohab Tulku agreed that it was an interesting idea and Dan should try it. And he said he could try it under one condition, that all of the students that wanted to go to the next level with this were followed by a mentor and a coach. So he would only let him do this on this condition. So everyone that went through this and wanted to continue with it ended up, myself, I had to align myself with one of Dan's recommended meditation coaches, Dr. John Churchill. So yes, it was something that they were keeping very close track of how it went. And also that person that's tracking you is looking at your own personality and how you're struggling or making sense with different parts of the teachings. So they're also starting to tailor it for you and sort out your own. Plenty of time to ask questions about your own queries and deal with it as a personal relationship. So so it was a big thing for Dan to be allowed to do this, but then there was also a lot of responsibility that he had to create this mentoring system. And for me, it worked really well. So I did. I did Dan's level 1 retreats. I did it twice because I enjoyed it so much, and it was so densely packed, so advanced in a way, so much there. I was happy to do it a second time and recognized more. And then I did a level 2 retreat, and I've continued ever. That was 2012 and 2013. So I ended up with John Churchill as my meditation coach, and I've had him ever since. He's somebody I check in with every 3 months. It used to be once a month, every 3 months now. So you know, it was the other thing I was missing from my practice, that people talk about gurus and teachers and having a personal relationship. I ended up with that personal relationship as a meditation coach, thanks to Dan's new way of teaching. And that very first level 1 retreat with Dan, because he set it up, and I did get a glimpse that I could rely on, then suddenly all of the other practices that were really similar to what I'd done before, I was seeing them from a slightly different perspective. And one of Dan's thing is taking meditation off the mat, that when you're meditating on the cushion, it's just a practice before you go out the house into your daily life. And really your meditation should be happening throughout the day. And this, I knew about this sort of thing, but Dan was very, very good at teaching us how we could do this, having a sort of a samadhi, which is a gathered together. You can still think and converse and do everything, but you're constantly checking your platform of operation, that it's from the view rather than from little Stu. So it's this sort of puts you in an identity relationship, a little bit like the Ramana Maharishi stuff, but the Dzogchen version of it, and a way
Yeah.
to in.
Candice Denver, have you ever come across her?
No.
Yeah, she's an American lady. She teach. I mean, she's got her own kind of teaching, but it's very much like Dzogchen, but it's her own thing. And she has this saying that short moments repeated many times becomes continuous.
Yes.
And it's that short moments of resting as awareness throughout the day. You know, if that becomes a the more you do that, it becomes a continuous experience.
Yeah.
And then the more you do it, the more it builds on that, and it just, there's no end to how deep it goes.
Yes.
And I think that's really important, to integrate you have some kind of practice that you do when you're not on the cushion. And it can't be like it's got to be a practice that you can do anywhere, anytime. It can't involve getting out a ritual bell and ringing it and singing a song or whatever, because you might be teaching a lesson or driving or giving a speech.
Yes, you need a discreet way of doing it.
Yeah, you need a way that's sort of invisible.
Yes.
But yeah, otherwise you can get very attached to just having your experience whilst on the meditation cushion. And then you have this kind of schizophrenic thing. And I mean, I'm talking about this from personal experience, where I would have this experience in meditation, and then I would get up and get on with my day, and I would lose it, and then I'd get it back again when I did my meditation. But then when I started to harness these two practices together, it became really helpful. And then there have been periods in my life where I haven't been able to do so much sitting meditation, and all I've been left with is the short moments, and that's carried me through those times. And I think another thing I appreciate about the Dzogchen stuff is, they do long retreats and long sitting periods, but they advocate shorter meditation sittings as well, of 20 minutes or whatever, half an hour, because you can become quite attached to doing 2 hours of meditation or whatever. You get attached to that in itself, and you need 2 hours to get into the right state of mind. But what if you've only got 20 minutes to go deep, so in it, I like the way they kind of they mix it up a bit like that.
That's it. They've got a lot of skillful means that are quite easily to switch on and switch off. They've got the fast switches and the more marinading type meditations, and they seem to include within their punching out instructions most of what is taught through Jnana Yoga. But I did find it refreshing to actually come and look at the Ramana Maharishi stuff and go through those exercises and then compare them to the pointing out instructions in Dzogchen. So that's more recently what I've done. And I mentioned to you also, I thought I came across the Douglas Harding headless work, which people often compare to the Dzogchen meditation of taking the view, sitting in a beautiful landscape and taking the whole view, including the blue sky, including the peripheral vision. So Dan Brown taught us these Dzogchen versions of taking the view. And then when I came across the Douglas Harding stuff, they've got a similar way of taking the view by these strange pointing exercises. So you get a definite sense of the knower and the field of experience, and a few tricks of recognizing your reflection in a mirror as the wrong way round, and it's always a much smaller version of it. We only ever see our own face as a reflection. Never ever do we see our own face or our own eyes. It's like an impossibility. And that, because Douglas Harding was really into Ramana Maharshi, when he wrote many of his books to try and explain the headless way, he's using Jnana yoga and mixing with his own discoveries of the pointing. And then I could look at that and then look back at the Dzogchen and go, oh yeah, Dzogchen is very complete. It's got versions of that in it, integrated in it. But it was really nice to come to the neighboring culture of India, looking into the Dzogchen meditation, and the Western culture of Douglas Harding, who grew up Plymouth Brethren Christian, had various awakenings through his own experimentations and walking in the Himalayas, and living in Calcutta as an architect and working for quite a few years, moving around India, visiting a small number of very potent, both male and female teachers, a small amount of them, and then also relating many of his own awakening experiences to Christian mystics, or a perennial collection of mystics that seem to have had a sort of similar thing to the headless experience. And
I think one of the perils that we need to highlight is that realization of formlessness is so powerful that it can suck you in a way that you can end up rejecting the other side of the non-dual thing, which is the world, the universe.
This is a really good important point. Yes, it's a step back to a radical duality. It's not non-dual.
Yeah, and it's the critique is the non-dual tantra's critique of some of the earlier Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras, and that kind of strict jnana yoga that takes you back and back, neti, into the nothingness. And it's a sort of transcendentalist thing of privileging
ascending direction.
And I mean, luckily, I certainly, when I did, that happened to me. And then I had this, I could describe it as the goddess crashed in on me and said, how dare you forget about me, kind of thing.
Yes, what about the Shakti?
Yeah, what about Shakti? What about Mother Nature? All of that stuff. But I think, it's what this developmental sequence that we were talking about, the path, that this scheme that practice tends to follow, is that people do their meditation practice, they have that recognition of formlessness, get slightly lost in it to some degree, and then they get pulled out of it again into this more complete non-dual recognition of the importance of the inner and the outer, and that it's all one thing. Shiva and Shakti are in this loving relationship, which is the whole. And ultimately they in that kind of unity vision give up their own identities into something that subsumes them into something greater even than Shiva and Shakti. It's this indescribable supreme being, that it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Getting but it's basically getting stuck in part of the path.
Yes.
Thinking that you've got to the end.
Yes.
Yeah. But there's more, and there's always more. And I think that anytime you have that moment where you think, right, here we go, this is it, the big one's happened, the alarm bell should go off.
Yes, it should be a warning to check and to talk to your coach or whatever. Yes.
And also, if you hear other people talking that way, your alarm bell should be going off too. That they are trying to sell you a view which is an incomplete one.
Yes, or it's a immature. They won't think it's immature, but it's
No.
an early stage non-duality realization that. I mean, I was lucky that I had a mentor in this thing. He reminded me, say, hold on, okay, you got this non-duality, but remember that the duality exists within it. And oh, of course. So it's like everything is in consciousness. The universe is in consciousness. Duality is in consciousness. Ultimately, it's all non-dual. In consciousness is consciousness. But there's a strange position of stepping back into the transpersonal identity and not coming, as you say, you need to step back and you come back, pulled back in by a Shakti, demanding that you work for her is the best thing that you can happen to you.
Formlessness is not the only transpersonal domain. There's a transpersonal form. You know, I mean, if we were to call transpersonal formlessness God, just if I would just to choose that, it's not gendered, but you know, let's just, for the sake of, let's play the game of using that language. Then there is the transpersonal world of form, is the goddess, you know, and or Mother Nature, you know, to use our European lingo. And Samuel Bonder said to me, I did a session with Samuel Bonder a while ago, and he said that samadhi, one translation of samadhi, is the equalization of pressure from the inside and the outside. And so it's a really important thing to just flag.
Yes.
Because people can hear people from the Dzogchen tradition or something talking about this stuff and think that they are saying that's the whole picture, is the emptiness.
Yes.
But they Dzogchen actually doesn't really have that encoded in the teachings. But that might an individual teacher might be emphasizing that unconsciously, due to their own personality or practice, you know.
It's interesting to observe somebody who's taken that stand and then seeing that the strange short-sightedness or unengagement that it might foster accidentally. I've had to stop getting annoyed with some teachers that I know are in that position, and go, okay, that's fine, that's where they're at, and they're selling this to the public, and they say that that's the okay, I can see how they've got it it's like a strange misinterpretation. And sometimes they're the non-practice people, because they say, oh, if you practice anything, you create an identity that practices it, and then that's going to stand in between you and your enlightenment. But it's not, it's going to stand between you and your enlightened disengagement.
And that's why traditionally people didn't like to give the teaching of the right at the beginning. So say Dan Brown is taking some of these, saying right at the outset, everything is perfect as it is, you know, on its own terms. That's the place from which we're going to start.
Yes.
And then we do the you know, the follow-on teachings. But you know, I think historically and traditionally people have been worried about doing that because of what you're saying, that someone gets that piece of information right at the start and they say, oh, right, well, I don't have to do anything then. But that's not what, so someone like Dan Brown, that is not what he's saying. But what's great about making this explicit is that right from the outset, you can tell somebody the end of the journey is this. And it's also here right at the beginning. You know, basically what I was saying, everything is perfect as it is, nothing you need to do. But
in the meantime,
make
a difference.
And even because it's perfect, I mean, it's difficult to talk about in language, but you have to practice, and because that's the place from which you do your practice. You know, because you don't know when you're going to die, could be tomorrow, and if you haven't been given that teaching right at the beginning, that, you know, that gives you that kind of relaxation of like, oh well, if I die tomorrow, it doesn't matter because
Hmm.
And all of this is perfect as it
Yes,
is.
yes. I did
Um,
I did what I could, and it's perfect.
yeah.
Yes. So,
And the alternative would be going through all that long, laborious path and then dying just before you get to the non-dual teachings.
yeah,
That
yeah,
would really suck.
yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
So
yeah.
I'm aware of the time.
Right. Well,
Sorry, we've run over a bit, but is there anything else you want to say? You feel that's important to say we haven't covered?
I think we've covered it all, and we've got to, for me, a very interesting point on this thing of like what the end point is, and it's something that I sort of had to become very clear about from a number of different angles, uh, and the same as the conversation we've just been having for the last couple of minutes, I guess. I really appreciate the fact that I did my Tai Chi and I did the ayahuasca. They were almost Shaktis that allowed me to go to the non-dual and then embody and come back in. So I've never stopped doing something. I just happily continued on, had the realizations, kept on doing the Tai Chi. Some people would have stopped doing that and then moved to meditation, then stopped doing the meditation because they've now got jhani. For me, John Churchill sort of challenged me 4 years ago and says, now you're coming back into it. You could have a very quiet, cushy life because you know how to drop stress and things like that, or you could do something that's a challenge. Challenge yourself. So Dzogchen, famous Tibetan Buddhist teacher, I can't remember her name, but she spent 12 years in a cave. Then she came out and spent 12 years running a nunnery for Tibetan Buddhist nuns. And so she said the time in the cave was the preparation to come out and run a chaotic nunnery. And that was the real work. And in a way, that's a perfect example of getting the non-dual realization through the practice and then realizing the real juice is whether you can integrate this in a real challenging, forward-thinking, bridge-building process. And I guess we all have to find our version of that. For me, I did the Tai Chi and the Qigong, and I never felt that Tai Chi and Qigong went deep enough in the meditation. So I've just kept on teaching the Tai Chi and Qigong, but now students who are interested, I'm happy to go there with the meditation with them. And I also, the sort of body Qigong, Tai Chi, the sort of subtle and some of the heart stuff. Yes, the Qigong and the Tai Chi. For me, I kept on my singing interests, so I really enjoy singing sacred songs as a sort of heart practice. So when John challenged me, I thought, yeah, I need to keep singing and sharing the wonderful Bhakti songs, and I need to sort of correct an imbalance in the Tai Chi and Qigong training. And if people want to go a little bit deeper in meditation, they should have that option. So that's how I sort of started to own what I was experiencing, being happy with my multiple belonging to 3 different spiritual traditions and bringing it together, and then at least in my own student relationship feel presenting really explicitly the value of being able to sing as a meditation, the value of being able to do a good physical practice, the value of being in touch with your somatics and your energetics, and that non-dual thing, instead of just trying to run to the one that would work or saying one of them was the answer. So I've refused to accept anyone as the ultimate answer, and so now I feel like I'm working for a couple of Shaktis after coming back into the experience. I love sharing the songs as a type of Shakti devotion, and sharing the Tai Chi as a type of Shakti devotion that exists in the world. And mostly people that I know are householder people with families, and getting this stuff so it works not in a monastic context, but for people in a daily life, living in urban environments. So that's sort of to round up how I integrated it under pressure and sort of made it my own, that our own experiences here in this cultural context, we relearn and take the best of what is presented to us, integrate it, and just share, because other people around us are in a very, very similar postmodern, often urban, living in England. You know, how do we do this for English people? How do we do this for people that come from wherever, Polish people that happen to be here, or Brazilian people that are interested in meditation because they've already learned ayahuasca? So some of my stuff is going to things like the London Psychedelic Society and really trying to encourage the new psychedelic psychonaut kids to consider doing Tai Chi and Qigong as an ongoing practice in between their psychonautical weekend experiments, to hopefully stabilize if they do have an awakening.
Yeah. Well, that's the way to integrate psychedelic experiences, is through doing all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do them, it's not going to become part of your DNA, so to speak. I think.
Very true.
Yeah. Well, is there where can people find out more about your work?
Well, my Tai Chi website is integral Tai Chi, all as one word, .com, and that's my formal Tai Chi website, and it does mention in there everything I do, and then on a practical level, I teach Saturday mornings in the park Tai Chi, and then at lunchtime I come home and I do an hour and a half Zoom, so anybody from anywhere can do Zoom Qigong and meditation with me. So they can write to me at Stuart Verity1.com, or we can I'll maybe send you the link, so I can give them two addresses in which they can contact me personally, or they can contact me through my Tai Chi website. And this sort of, it's been a great opportunity to do this, because rather than just standard Tai Chi and Qigong that I was taught, it's a more integrated, more engaging for me to teach and for people to practice. So
cool. That sounds great. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story. And I do hope that it'll benefit other people, you know, with the similar intuitions, similar interests, you know, wherever they are along their path. It's I think it's really helpful to hear how things have been for other people.
Yeah, similarly, I can hear in your story very similar assault course of things to deal with, and both seem to have dealt with them in very, very similar ways to weave through this. And it's been because there is some real skill in those traditional systems, and there's some real skill in the mature Western teachers like Dan Brown and Wilbur that have showed us how we can do them as householders in a postmodern life, with with everything we need to sort of turn it into an ecologically orientated, conscious, spiritual orientation that we have.
That's a nice statement to finish on. Thank you so much, Stuart, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Cool.
All right. Lots of love. Bye-bye.
Bye.